In Cedar Grove General Hospital, a 68-year-old grandmother was about to discover the most devastating truth of her life. What started as a family graduation celebration took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her own supposed death. Margaret Maggie Williams wasn't your typical retired educator. For decades, she had been the family's emotional anchor, known for her selfless devotion. When she collapsed while serving pie, she had no idea she was walking into consciousness trapped in silence. Maggie could hear everything as her family planned her funeral in the next room, revealing their true nature when they thought no one was listening. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast golden shadows across the Williams family backyard, where white tablecloths fluttered in the gentle Iowa breeze. Margaret Maggie Williams moved through the gathered crowd with the practiced grace of someone who had orchestrated countless family celebrations over the decades. At 68, she still carried herself with the quiet authority that had made her such an effective elementary school principal, her silver hair pinned back in the same neat style she'd worn for 20 years. "More lemonade, Mrs. Patterson?" she asked Dorothy's elderly neighbor, already reaching for the pitcher before receiving an answer. Everything had to be perfect for Tommy's graduation party. Her youngest grandson had worked so hard to finish high school, and after the struggles of his teenage years, this moment felt like a victory for the entire family. The backyard buzzed with conversation as relatives and friends celebrated Tommy's achievement. Maggie's trained eye swept across the gathering, cataloging details with the thoroughness that had served her well in managing unruly classrooms. Her son Bob stood near the barbecue grill, gesturing animatedly as he held court with his business colleagues. Her daughter Susan was helping her own teenage daughter serve drinks, the two of them moving in perfect synchronization. Even Tommy seemed relaxed for once, accepting congratulations with genuine smiles instead of his usual defensive shrugs. Harry, her husband of 47 years, was deep in conversation with his old friend Frank Morrison near the rose bushes Maggie had planted when they first moved to this house. She caught fragments of their discussion, something about interest rates and market fluctuations, and smiled. Some things never changed. Harry could find a way to discuss insurance and investments at a birthday party for toddlers. "Grandma Maggie!" Tommy's voice carried across the yard. "Where's that famous apple pie you promised?" She laughed, the sound carrying years of joy and pride. "Coming right up, sweetheart." The pie sat cooling on the kitchen windowsill, its golden crust bearing the perfect lattice work that had taken her 40 years to master. She'd made this same recipe for every family celebration since the children were small, and Tommy had been requesting it specifically since he could talk. Maggie carefully lifted the heavy ceramic serving tray, balancing the pie alongside a stack of her grandmother's china plates. The weight felt familiar in her hands, though she noticed it seemed heavier than it used to. Getting older, she supposed, though she'd never admit such a thing out loud. Harry worried enough about her health. As it was, fussing over every doctor's appointment and monitoring her blood pressure medication like a hawk, she pushed through the screen door with her hip, calling out, "Here comes the grand finale!" The assembled crowd turned toward her voice, faces lighting up with anticipation. Tommy bounded over, his graduation cap sitting askew on his dark hair. "You're the best, Grandma," he said, reaching to help her with the tray. "Nonsense," she replied, pulling the tray protectively against her chest. "I've been carrying pies to family gatherings since before you were born. I think I can manage." The words died in her throat as something strange happened. The familiar weight of the tray suddenly felt impossible, as if someone had filled it with concrete. Her vision blurred at the edges, and a peculiar tingling sensation swept down her left arm. The cheerful sounds of the party seemed to fade, replaced by a rushing noise like wind through distant trees. "Grandma?" Tommy's voice sounded far away, though she could see his face just inches from hers. His expression was shifting from amusement to concern, his eyebrows drawing together in the same worried frown he'd worn as a little boy. The tray slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Time seemed to slow as she watched her grandmother's china plates tumble through the air, the perfect apple pie following in a graceful arc. The crash, when it came, sounded like thunder in her ears. Ceramic shards scattered across the wooden deck, mixing with chunks of apple and flaky crust. Then the world tilted sideways, and Maggie felt herself falling. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Harry's face, his features twisted with terror as he ran toward her across the yard, Frank Morrison close behind. The last thing she heard was Susan's scream, high and sharp, cutting through, the confused babble of voices like a knife. Then nothing. The ambulance ride passed in fragments, the wail of sirens, Harry's voice breaking as he spoke to the paramedics, the rhythmic beeping of machines. Maggie felt herself floating above it all, watching from some impossible distance as uniformed strangers worked over her motionless body. She tried to speak, to tell Harry she was all right, but no words came. She tried to squeeze his hand when he grasped hers, but her fingers remained still. What's happening to me? The emergency room at Cedar Grove General Hospital erupted into controlled chaos as the ambulance doors swung open. Maggie watched the medical team transfer her body to a gurney, noting with strange detachment how small and fragile she looked under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her silver hair had come loose from its pins, spreading across the pillow like spilled water. Dr. Elizabeth Carson appeared at her bedside, her familiar face grave with concentration. Maggie had known Elizabeth since she was a gangly 12-year-old whose father had delivered half the babies in Cedar Grove. Now she was the hospital's chief neurologist, her gentle hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined Maggie's unresponsive form. "Mrs. Williams, can you hear me?" Dr. Carson's voice was professional but kind. "If you can hear me, try to squeeze my hand." "I'm here!" Maggie screamed silently. "I'm right here. I can hear everything." But her body remained utterly still, betraying nothing of the frantic consciousness trapped within. Harry paced the small examination room like a caged animal, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled, his tie loosened and askew. She was fine, he kept repeating to anyone who would listen. She was serving pie, talking and laughing. How does someone just collapse? Like that? Dr. Carson's expression grew more serious as she completed her initial examination. She pulled Harry aside, her voice dropping to the low, careful tone medical professionals used when delivering difficult news. "Mr. Williams, I need to be honest with you. Your wife has suffered what appears to be a massive stroke. The preliminary scans show significant brain activity disruption. We're going to need to run more comprehensive tests, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this could be very serious." Harry's face went ashen. He sank into a plastic chair, beside Maggie's bed, reaching for her hand with fingers that trembled. "But she'll wake up, right? People recover from strokes all the time. She's strong, always has been. Took care of everyone else her whole life." Dr. Carson's silence spoke volumes. The ICU waiting room filled gradually as word spread through the family network. Bob arrived first, still wearing his khaki slacks and polo shirt from the graduation party, his normally composed executive demeanor cracking at the edges. He immediately began making phone calls, his voice crisp and businesslike as he contacted insurance companies and arranged for coverage at his job. Susan came next, her arms around her teenage daughter Emma, both of their faces streaked with tears. She moved through the waiting room like a woman in shock, automatically straightening magazines and offering tissues to other family members, her natural caretaking instincts taking over even in crisis. Tommy was the last to arrive, having stayed, behind to clean up the broken china and scattered pie from the deck. His young face was pale with guilt, and he kept running his hands through his hair, a nervous habit Maggie had observed since he was small. "This is my fault," he said to No one in particular. If I hadn't asked for the pie, if she hadn't been carrying that heavy tray— Stop it! Bob's voice was sharp with his own stress. This isn't anyone's fault. These things just happen. But Maggie could see the fear behind her eldest son's authoritative tone. She could see it in all their faces. The sudden, terrible awareness of mortality that comes when someone you've always thought invincible proves to be frighteningly human. Dr. Carson emerged from the ICU at nearly midnight, her expression carefully neutral. The family gathered around her in a semicircle, their faces etched with exhaustion and dread. The tests confirm that Mrs. Williams has suffered a massive cerebrovascular accident, a stroke. The damage is extensive, affecting multiple areas of the brain responsible for motor function and consciousness. At this point, she's in what we call a persistent vegetative state. Harry's voice was barely a whisper. What does that mean exactly? It means that while her body continues to function with mechanical support, there's no evidence of conscious brain activity. She's not aware of her surroundings, not experiencing pain or discomfort. For all practical purposes. Dr. Carson's voice trailed off. No. Maggie's silent scream echoed in the prison of her own mind. I'm here. I can hear every word. I'm conscious. I'm aware. I'm still me. But her body lay motionless on the hospital bed, betraying nothing of the desperate woman trapped within. How long? Susan's voice was thick with tears. It's impossible to say. Some patients in this condition can survive for years with proper care. Others. Dr. Carson spread her hands helplessly. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. As the family absorbed this devastating news, Maggie found herself observing their reactions with the same careful attention she'd once brought to studying her students. Harry sat frozen, staring at his hands. Bob was already calculating. She could see it in his expression. Thinking about practical matters, logistics, what came next. Susan wept quietly, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Tommy just looked lost, a young man suddenly confronted with the fragility of the adults he'd always counted on. None of them suspected that she could see everything, hear everything, understand everything. They spoke around her bed as if she were already gone, their voices carrying the particular tone people used in the presence of the dead. And as the night wore on, as she lay trapped in the darkness of her own body, Maggie began to understand that her real ordeal was just beginning, because tomorrow, the family would have to start making decisions about her care, about her future, decisions that would reveal who they really were when they thought no one was watching. The machines beside her bed beeped steadily, marking time in a world where she existed but could not participate. Outside her window, dawn was beginning to break over. Cedar Grove, painting the sky in soft pastels that reminded her of the watercolor paintings she'd once helped her students create. But Maggie couldn't see the sunrise. She could only listen as her family began the first whispered conversations about what happened next, their voices carrying currents of grief and practicality that would soon reshape everything she thought. She knew about the people she loved most. Harry's hand tightened on the coffee cup as he finished speaking with Frank in the hospital corridor. The bitter liquid had gone cold hours ago, but he continued to grip it like an anchor. 3 days had passed since Maggie's collapse. 3 days of sterile waiting rooms and hushed conversations with medical staff who spoke in careful, measured tones that revealed nothing and everything at once. Dr. Carson approached the family, clustered in the ICU waiting room, her expression carrying the weight of difficult news. She'd changed from her weekend clothes into crisp hospital scrubs, but her eyes showed the fatigue of someone who'd spent 72 hours wrestling with an impossible diagnosis. I've completed the comprehensive neurological assessment, she began, her voice steady but kind. The results confirm our initial fears. Mrs. Williams shows no measurable brain activity in the areas responsible for consciousness, voluntary movement, or cognitive function. The damage from the stroke is extensive and, I'm afraid, irreversible. Harry felt the words hit him like physical blows. Beside him, Susan made a small, wounded sound, while Bob's jaw tightened into the hard line he'd worn throughout his corporate career when facing unwelcome quarterly reports. "What are you saying exactly?" Bob's question was sharp, executive-like. "What are our options here?" Dr. Carson's pause lasted only seconds, but to Maggie, trapped in the prison of her unresponsive body, it felt like hours. "Tell them I'm here," she screamed silently. "Tell them I can hear every word. I'm saying that your mother is in a persistent vegetative state. Her body continues to function with mechanical support, but there's no evidence of consciousness or awareness. She's not experiencing pain or discomfort, but she's also not present in any meaningful way." "I am present," Maggie's mental voice echoed futilely in the darkness. "I'm right here. I can hear you giving up on me." Tommy shifted, uncomfortably in his plastic chair, his graduation cap still sitting on the side table where he'd placed it when they first arrived. "But people wake up from comas, right? I mean, you hear stories." "Those are rare cases involving different types of brain injuries," Dr. Carson explained gently. "Mrs. Williams's condition is different, more severe." Harry's voice, when it came, sounded older than his 71 years. "How long do we have to decide about what comes next?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Maggie felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest as she realized what her husband was really asking. Not how long until she recovered, but how long they had to decide whether to keep her alive. "There's no immediate urgency," Dr. Carson said carefully. "She's stable on life support, but you'll want to consider your options, speak with other family members, perhaps consult with your spiritual advisor. These decisions are never easy." After Dr. Carson left, the family sat in stunned silence. The waiting room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. Maggie could hear the distant sounds of the hospital, monitors, beeping, nurses making their rounds, the occasional announcement over the intercom, but her family's silence was deafening. Finally, Bob cleared his throat. "We need to be practical about this. Mom would want us to be practical." "Would I?" Maggie wondered bitterly. "When exactly did I tell you that I'd want you to give up on me after 3 days?" "There are arrangements to consider," Bob continued, his voice taking on the efficient tone he used in business meetings. "Insurance policies, the will, funeral plans. If this is going to be the outcome, we should start thinking about these things." Susan looked up sharply. "Bob, she's not dead yet." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I know that," Bob snapped, then moderated his tone. "I'm just saying we need to be prepared. Mom always said she didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to linger if there was no hope." "When did I say that?" Maggie tried desperately to remember any conversation where she might have expressed such sentiments. She'd always been focused on living, on taking care of everyone else. When had she ever talked about dying? Harry stood abruptly. "I need some air. Frank's coming by in a bit." He wanted to pay his respects. As Harry walked toward the elevators, Susan turned to her brothers. "This doesn't feel right. It's only been 3 days. Shouldn't we wait longer? Get a second opinion?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "I agree with Susan. Maybe there's something the doctors are missing. Maybe what?" Bob's frustration was evident. "Maybe she's going to miraculously wake up and everything will be fine?" "Susan, you've seen the scans. You heard what Dr. Carson said. The brain damage is massive. But what if she can hear us?" Susan's voice was small, almost childlike. "What if she knows we're talking about giving up on her?" "I can hear you!" Maggie screamed into the void. "I can hear every word, and I'm begging you not to give up." Bob's expression softened slightly. Susie, she's not suffering. Dr. Carson made that clear. She's not aware of anything. It's not like she's trapped in there, listening to us. The irony was so brutal that Maggie felt as if her silent heart might break. Her own son, the child she'd raised and sacrificed for, was describing her exact situation while dismissing it as impossible. 20 minutes later, Frank Morrison arrived, his presence filling the waiting room with the particular energy of someone uncomfortable in hospitals. He embraced Harry with the awkward affection of men who'd known each other for decades, then nodded solemnly to the children. Harry, I'm so sorry. Maggie's always been like family to me. Has she? Maggie found herself questioning things she'd never thought to question before. Frank had been around for years, but had she ever been anything? More to him than Harry's wife. The woman who made coffee when he came over to discuss business. Frank, could you walk with me? I need to step outside for a minute, Harry said, his voice strained. As the two men left together, Maggie felt a chill of premonition. Harry's relationship with Frank had always been based on business and male bonding that excluded her. Now, with her supposedly unconscious, what might they discuss? In the corridor outside, Harry's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Frank, I don't know what to do. The doctors are saying there's no hope, but how do you make a decision? Like this? How do you decide to let someone go? Frank's response was measured, practical. Harry, you've got to think about what Maggie would want. She was always a sensible woman. Would she want to be kept alive like this, hooked up to machines? I don't know, Harry admitted, his voice breaking slightly. We never really talked about it. You always think you have more time. We have time now, Maggie wanted to scream. If you'd just wait, if you'd just believe I might come back. Frank placed a hand on Harry's shoulder. There's something else. You need to consider, buddy, the practical side. Insurance, finances, a long-term care situation like this. It could bankrupt you. Wipe out everything you and Maggie worked for. Harry was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become more calculating. The life insurance policy? It's substantial. Enough to pay off the house, cover all the debts? Exactly. And if this drags on for months or years, eating up all your savings, what's left for you? What's left for the kids' inheritance? Maggie felt something die inside her chest. Her husband, her partner of 47 years, was discussing her life insurance payout while she lay not 50 feet away, conscious and aware and desperately trying to signal her presence. I've been thinking about that, Harry continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The financial relief would be significant. I could finally pay off those gambling debts, start fresh. Maybe even think about relocating, getting away from all these memories. Gambling debts? Maggie's mind reeled. What gambling debts? Frank nodded knowingly. Helen's been asking about you, by the way. She cares about you, Harry. She understands what you're going through. Helen? The name hit Maggie like a physical blow. Helen Patterson was a widow from their church, someone who'd always been overly solicitous toward Harry during coffee hour, always finding excuses to touch his arm or comment on his insights during Bible study. Helen's been very supportive during this difficult time, Harry said carefully. It's nice to have someone who understands. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Harry was having an affair. While she lay fighting for her life, her husband was discussing their future together, a future that required Maggie to be permanently out of the picture. Back in the waiting room, the Williams children were having their own difficult conversation. Bob had pulled out his phone and was scrolling through something that looked suspiciously like funeral home websites. I'm just gathering information, he said defensively when Susan shot him a sharp look. If we're going to have to make arrangements, we should know what's involved. Arrangements, Tommy repeated flatly. You mean planning Mom's funeral while she's still alive? She's not alive, Tommy. Bob's voice cracked with frustration and something that might have been grief. Her body is alive, but Mom is gone. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we can start figuring out how to move forward. Susan began to cry quietly, and her teenage daughter Emma moved closer to comfort her. I can't believe we're talking about this, Susan whispered. 3 days ago, she was serving pie at Tommy's graduation party. I know, Bob said, his voice gentling. But we have to be realistic. The doctors aren't giving us any hope. And honestly, would Mom want to live like this? Hooked up to machines, no awareness, no dignity? I have awareness, Maggie screamed. Silently. I have dignity. I'm still here. There's something else we need to discuss, Bob continued reluctantly. The financial aspect. Dad's insurance only covers so much. Long-term care for someone in Mom's condition. It's expensive. Really expensive. Tommy looked up sharply. Are you saying we should let Mom die because it's too expensive to keep her alive? I'm saying we need to consider all the factors, Bob replied defensively. What would Mom want us to do? Bankrupt the family keeping her body alive when there's no hope of recovery? As her children debated her fate in terms of dollars and cents, Maggie felt a new kind of despair settling over her. She was beginning to understand that the family she'd devoted her life to, the people she'd sacrificed everything for, were capable of calculating her worth in ways she'd never imagined. Outside in the corridor, Harry and Frank were wrapping up their conversation. Think about it, Harry, Frank was saying. Maggie's gone. The woman you married, the life you built together, that's over. The question now is what kind of future you want to build for yourself. As the two men returned to the waiting room, Maggie lay in her hospital bed, fully conscious and utterly powerless, listening to the sound of her family planning her funeral while she was still alive to hear every word. The machines beside her bed continued their steady rhythm, marking time in a world where she existed but could not participate. And somewhere in the darkness of her trapped consciousness, Maggie began to understand that her real fight was just beginning. The whispered conversations about what happens next had grown louder by the end of the first week, and Maggie's heart, the only part of her that seemed to respond to emotion anymore, hammered against her ribs as she lay in the sterile darkness of her ICU room. The funeral home representative had left his business card with Bob that afternoon, and the casual way her eldest son had tucked it into his wallet made her want to scream. But it was the conversation she overheard between Harry and Frank Morrison, during the evening visiting hours that shattered what remained of her illusions about the man she'd loved for 47 years. I can't keep this up much longer, Frank. Harry's voice carried the weight of confession as he spoke in low tones near the window, thinking Maggie couldn't hear him over the steady beeping of the monitors. The bills are piling up, and Helen's been asking questions about when I'm going to make a decision. Helen. The name hit Maggie like a physical blow. Helen Carpenter, the widow from their church who'd been bringing Harry casseroles and sympathy since her husband died 2 years ago. The same Helen who'd been calling the house with increasing frequency, always with some excuse about church committee business. How bad is it? Frank's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who already knew the answer. Worse than... I told you before. The poker games at Murphy's got out of hand last winter. I'm down $43,000, and that's not counting what I borrowed against the house. Harry's admission came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding it back for months. The insurance money would clear everything and give me a fresh start with Helen. Maggie felt something die inside her chest that had nothing to do with her medical condition. The gambling had been going on for months, years, and Harry was planning a future with another woman while she lay here fighting for her life. Maggie never knew, Frank asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Maggie never knew about a lot of things. Harry's voice carried a bitterness that made Maggie's trapped consciousness recoil. She was always so busy being the perfect principal, the perfect mother, the perfect wife, always organizing everyone else's life while I felt like I was disappearing in my own house. The casual cruelty of his words was worse than a physical slap. 47 years of marriage, and this was how he really felt about her? About their life together? You sure? About this Helen thing? Frank's question carried the weight of an old friend's concern. Moving that fast after? Helen understands me in ways Maggie never did. Harry's interruption was firm, decisive. She listens when I talk. She makes me feel like I matter. The conversation was interrupted by Dorothy's arrival, her sensible, shoes clicking against the hospital's polished floors with military precision. Harry and Frank shifted to discussing baseball scores, but the damage was done. Maggie lay there absorbing the devastation of learning that her husband had been living a double life, planning her replacement, and counting on her death to solve his financial problems. But Dorothy's presence brought its own revelations. After Frank left and Harry went to the cafeteria, Maggie's sister pulled up a chair close to the bed and began speaking in the frank, unfiltered way that had always been her trademark. You know, Maggie, I should probably feel guilty talking to you like this when you can't answer back. Dorothy's voice carried decades of suppressed resentment. But maybe it's better this way. Maybe you'll finally hear some truths you've been avoiding your whole life. Maggie's consciousness focused intently on her sister's words, sensing that something significant was coming. I was in love with Harry first, you know, before you ever met him at that college mixer. Dorothy's confession hit like a thunderbolt. I saw him in the library 3 weeks before that party. We talked for hours about books and dreams and all the things we wanted from life. He asked me to coffee, and I thought, well, it doesn't matter. What I thought. The revelation reframed decades of family history in Maggie's mind. Dorothy's persistent single status, her sharp comments about Harry over the years, her complicated relationship with family gatherings. Then you walked into that mixer wearing that yellow dress, and he forgot I existed, just like everyone always forgot I existed when you were around. Dorothy's voice carried the accumulated pain of a lifetime of being second choice. Pretty Maggie with her easy smile and her natural way of making everyone feel special. I convinced myself I was better off alone, told myself I didn't need what you had. The machines beeped steadily around them as Dorothy continued her confession to what she believed was an unconscious sister. But watching him these past few days, seeing how quickly he's planning your funeral and thinking about that carpenter woman, maybe I should be grateful. Maybe you saved me from discovering what kind of man he really is. Dorothy's laugh was bitter, decades of suppressed feelings finally finding voice. At least my loneliness was honest. The conversation was interrupted by Bob's return from his phone call in the hallway, but Maggie had heard enough to understand that her family was built on foundations far more fragile than she'd ever imagined. Her sister had harbored secret love and resentment for decades. Her husband was planning her replacement while counting insurance money. And the children she'd raised with such devotion were already discussing the division of her belongings as if she were already buried. As Bob settled into his chair and began reading work emails on his phone, Maggie caught fragments of his whispered conversation with someone. His wife, she realized, about mortgage payments and job security. Even her responsible eldest son was viewing her condition through the lens of financial necessity. The evening shift brought new nurses and the familiar ritual of family members taking turns at her bedside. But now Maggie listened to every conversation with new awareness, hearing the undercurrents of self-interest beneath the expressions of grief. She was learning that the family she'd devoted her life to building was held together more by habit and obligation than by the genuine love she'd always assumed. Harry returned from the cafeteria with coffee and the casual announcement that he'd spoken with their pastor about funeral arrangements. Just preliminary discussions, he assured Bob and Susan, though his tone suggested nothing preliminary about it. Pastor Stevens wants to know about music preferences and readings. As her family discussed the details of her death with increasing specificity, Maggie felt her consciousness retreating into a place of pure determination. She might be trapped in her own body, unable to communicate or move, but she was still alive, still fighting. And now she had something beyond survival to fight for. She needed to live long enough to see justice for the lies and betrayals that were being revealed in what everyone assumed were her final days. The monitors around her bed continued their steady rhythm, marking time in a life that everyone believed was ending. But Maggie's mind was more alert than it had been since her collapse, focused on the singular goal of finding a way to signal her consciousness before her family buried her under the weight of their own guilty secrets. The funeral arrangements were now in full swing, and Maggie's children had fallen into their familiar roles with devastating efficiency. From her prison of paralyzed flesh, she watched Bob assume command of the logistics while Susan managed the emotional needs of extended family, and Tommy retreated into guilty silence. But it was their private conversations, the ones they thought she couldn't hear, that revealed the true cost of her lifetime devotion to holding their family together. The breaking point came during Bob's phone call with his wife on Tuesday evening. He'd stepped into the hallway, thinking the closed door would muffle his voice, but hospital walls were thin and Maggie's hearing had become preternaturally sharp. "Sarah, I can't keep pretending everything's fine." Bob's voice cracked with the strain of maintaining his composed facade. "I got the final notice from the bank today. If I don't make the payment by Friday, we lose the house." Maggie's heart would have stopped if it weren't already struggling. Her responsible, successful eldest son was facing bankruptcy. The severance package barely lasted 3 months, and the unemployment isn't covering the mortgage. "I've been drinking. Again, not just wine with dinner, Sarah. The real stuff. The stuff that makes me forget that I'm 45 years old and can't provide for my own family." Bob's confession poured out in a torrent of suppressed shame. "Mom's life insurance policy is our only way out. $200,000 would clear the mortgage and give us breathing room until I find something." The casual way he discussed her death as financial salvation made Maggie's consciousness recoil in horror. This was the son who'd called her every Sunday for 20 years, who'd never missed a birthday or anniversary, who'd built his entire identity around being the family's rock of stability. "I know how it sounds," Bob continued, his voice thick, with self-loathing. "I know I'm basically praying for my mother to die so I can pay my bills, but what choice do I have? Tommy's never contributed anything to this family, and Susan gave up any claim to responsibility when she decided to be a stay-at-home mom. It's always been up to me to fix everything." The bitterness in his voice revealed decades of resentment that Maggie had never suspected. Her golden child, the one she'd been so proud of, felt trapped by the very expectations she'd helped create. When Bob returned to the room, it was Susan's turn to reveal her hidden self. She'd been coordinating with the florist about arrangements when her daughter called, and the conversation took a direction that shattered another of Maggie's fundamental assumptions about her family. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Susan's voice carried a lightness that seemed inappropriate for someone planning her mother's funeral. "This might sound terrible, but I've been thinking about going back to school, to nursing school." Maggie listened as her daughter, the one who'd always been content with domestic life, revealed dreams that had been buried for 20 years. "I know the timing is awful, but maybe this is a sign. Maybe this is my chance to finally do something for myself." Susan's voice grew stronger, more confident. "I've spent 23 years being what everyone needed me to be. The perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother. But I was supposed to be a doctor, remember? Before I met David, before I got pregnant with Emma." The conversation revealed a lifetime of suppressed ambition that Maggie had never recognized. She'd always praised Susan for her selfless devotion to family, never realizing it came at the cost of her daughter's own dreams. The life insurance money could pay for school. I could finally finish what I started. I could become someone other than just Tommy's mom, or David's wife, or Maggie Williams' daughter. Susan's voice carried a freedom that sounded almost giddy. Is that horrible? That I'm excited about finally living my own life? Even Tommy, whom Maggie had expected to be genuinely grieving, revealed his own complicated relationship with her condition. During his conversation with his girlfriend later that evening, she learned that even her most authentic child harbored resentments she'd never suspected. The worst part is how they're all looking at me. Tommy's voice carried familiar frustration. Like I'm going to mess up the funeral arrangements or say something inappropriate. Even when Mom's dying, I'm still the family screw-up. His girlfriend's murmured response was too quiet to hear, but Tommy's reply cut deep. You want to know the truth? Part of me is relieved. Mom spent so much energy trying to fix me, trying to make me into something I wasn't. Maybe now I can just be myself without disappointing her every time I breathe wrong. The devastating honesty of her children's confessions left Maggie reeling. The family she'd devoted her life to building, the relationships she'd carefully nurtured and protected, were revealed as constructions built on obligation and resentment rather than genuine love. But it was Harry's elderly mother, Evelyn, who delivered the most brutal assessment when she arrived that evening from the nursing home. The 94-year-old woman had lost most of her social filters, and her observations carried the sharp clarity of someone who no longer bothered with polite lies. Well, Evelyn announced to the assembled family as she settled into the visitor's chair, I suppose you're all relieved to finally get this over with. Maggie's been holding this family together with spit and determination for decades. Now you can all stop pretending to be better than you are. The uncomfortable silence that followed her pronouncement confirmed what Maggie had begun to suspect, that her life's work of creating family harmony had been built on a foundation of lies, suppressed resentments, and financial dependencies that masqueraded as love. As the evening wore on and her family continued their discussions about flower arrangements and burial plots, Maggie felt her consciousness shifting from grief to something harder and more determined. They thought she was unconscious, safely dead to their revelations. But she was learning truths that would reshape everything if she could find a way to signal that she was still alive to witness their betrayals. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking time in what everyone believed were her final days. But Maggie's mind was crystallizing around a single burning purpose: survival long enough to hold them all accountable for the lies they were telling themselves about love, family, and what really mattered when they thought no one was watching. The funeral home brochures lay spread across the ICU waiting room table like a macabre buffet of final choices. Maggie could hear the rustling of glossy pages through her partially open door as her family debated casket styles and flower arrangements. With the casual efficiency of people planning a dinner party, the mahogany is beautiful, but honestly, the oak is more practical. Susan's voice carried that same tone she'd used when helping her teenage daughter shop for prom dresses. Mom always preferred understated elegance anyway. 2 weeks had passed since her collapse, and the pretense of hope had evaporated like morning dew. No one spoke of recovery anymore. Even Tommy had stopped reading to her from his favorite books, though he still visited daily, sitting silently by her bedside with the weight of premature grief aging his young face. I think she'd want the service at First Methodist, Bob said, his voice taking on the authoritative cadence he used at board meetings. She taught Sunday school there for 15 years. Pastor Stevens already said he'd be honored to officiate. Maggie felt a surge of bitter irony. They were planning her funeral with more attention to detail than they'd shown her actual life in years. When was the last time any of them had asked what she wanted while she could still answer? What about the music? Dorothy's voice held an unusual tremor. She always loved Amazing Grace, but that seems so Final. Because it is final, Dot, Harry said quietly. She's gone. The doctors have made that clear. Gone. The word echoed in Maggie's trapped consciousness like a death knell. She wanted to scream, to shatter every piece of medical equipment in the room, to somehow prove that she was still present, still fighting, still desperately alive behind the mask of her unresponsive body. I've been thinking about the house, Harry continued, and something in his tone made Maggie's internal alarm sound. It's too big for just me, and with the property taxes going up. Dad, you don't need to make any big decisions right now, Susan interrupted gently, but Harry pressed on. Helen thinks I should consider something smaller. Maybe one of those senior communities with activities and… He trailed off, perhaps realizing he'd revealed too much. Helen. The name hit Maggie like a physical blow. Helen Morrison from the church auxiliary, the widow who'd been bringing Harry casseroles and companionship since her husband died last spring. The woman who always seemed to find excuses to touch Harry's arm during coffee hour, whose laugh rang a little too loudly at his jokes. Helen thinks? Dorothy's voice sharpened with the predatory instinct of someone who'd spent decades collecting family secrets. Since when does Helen Morrison get a vote in family decisions? The silence that followed was thick with implications. Maggie could practically hear Harry's internal scrambling, the desperate search for words that might undo his casual betrayal. She's been helpful, he said finally, during this difficult time, just being a good friend. Friend? Bob's voice carried a cold skepticism that Maggie had never heard directed at his father. Is that what we're calling it? That's enough, Harry snapped, but the damage was done. The cat was out of the bag, prowling through the family's forced civility with claws extended. Maggie's mind reeled. How long had this been going on? The late-night phone calls Harry claimed were from his fishing buddies. The Wednesday evening men's Bible study that never seemed to include any actual studying. The new cologne he'd started wearing to church. We should probably discuss the will, Bob said, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant he was furious but trying to maintain control. Mom's attorney called yesterday about scheduling a reading. Already? Susan sounded shocked. She's not even… shouldn't we wait until… Until what? Dorothy's bitter laugh cut through the air. Until she miraculously wakes up? The doctors have been clear about that possibility. Impossible, Maggie wanted to shout. The possibility isn't impossible. I'm right here, listening to every cruel word you're saying about dividing up my life like pieces of pie. There's the life insurance to consider, too, Harry said quietly. $250,000. It'll help with expenses. The way he said it made Maggie's skin crawl. Help with expenses, or help with starting a new life with Helen Morrison, in a convenient senior community where widower Harry could play the grieving husband while building something fresh with his helpful friend? I've been thinking about Mom's jewelry, Susan said, and Maggie could hear her opening the small box they'd brought from home. The pearl necklace should probably go to Tommy's future wife whenever that happens, but the diamond earrings Dad gave her for their 25th anniversary, those were expensive, Bob interjected. We should have them appraised. Appraised? As if her memories had a market value, as if the weight of 25 years of marriage could be measured in carats and cash. I'd like her recipe box, Susan continued, and maybe some of her books, the ones she was always rereading. The china set is valuable, Dorothy added. Spode blue Italian, a complete service for 12. I helped her pick it out for her wedding. They were dissecting her life with surgical precision, each claiming pieces of her existence as if she were already buried. Maggie wanted to weep, but even tears were beyond her reach. What about the garden? Tommy's voice, speaking for the pie, first time, carried a broken quality that pierced through Maggie's rage. She spent so much time with her roses. They're going to die if nobody takes care of them. The simple observation, so much more meaningful than discussions of jewelry and china, nearly broke Maggie's heart. Tommy understood what the others missed, that she was more than the sum of her possessions, more than an estate to be divided and distributed. "We can hire someone," Harry said dismissively. "Or just let them go natural. They're only flowers." Only flowers. Only the hobby that had brought her joy for 30 years. Only the living beauty she'd nurtured through seasons of drought and storm. Only the one thing that had remained constant through all the changes and challenges of their marriage. Dr. Carson's voice in the hallway interrupted Maggie's spiral of betrayal and rage. She was speaking to another doctor, their conversation carrying clearly through the thin walls. "The family is pushing for a timeline," she said quietly. "They want to know about withdrawing life support. Legally, she's got a living will that specifies no extraordinary measures." "Any sign of awareness?" the other voice asked. "None that I can document. Though there's something." Dr. Carson paused. "Call it intuition, but sometimes I feel like she's more present than the tests indicate. Her vitals sometimes spike during family conversations." Maggie tried to channel every ounce of her consciousness toward affecting those monitors, toward making the spikes more dramatic, more obvious. But her body remained stubbornly unresponsive to her desperate mental commands. "Probably just autonomic responses," the other doctor said. "The body can react even when the mind is gone." Gone. There was that word again, sealing her fate with clinical certainty. Back in the waiting room, the family had moved on to discussing funeral flowers and memorial donations. They spoke of her in past tense, sharing memories that felt more like eulogies than expressions of love. But beneath the surface planning, Maggie could hear the undercurrents of resentment and greed that her crisis had exposed. Harry's eagerness to move forward with Helen, Bob's careful calculation of inheritance values, Susan's quiet inventory of meaningful possessions, Dorothy's bitter satisfaction at finally having her say about family dynamics. Only Tommy seemed genuinely broken by the loss of her, and even he was beginning to accept what everyone told him was inevitable. As night fell over the hospital, Maggie lay in her mechanical tomb, listening to the beeps and whirs that marked time in her suspended existence. Her family was already living in a world without her, making plans and decisions based on the assumption that Margaret Williams had effectively died 2 weeks ago. But she hadn't died. She was trapped, furious, and increasingly desperate to find some way to signal her presence before they made the final decision to let her body follow where they believed her mind had already gone. The funeral planning continued in hushed tones. Beyond her door, while Maggie fought the most important battle of her life, the battle to prove she was still worth fighting for. The decision came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the same clinical detachment Dr. Carson might use to discuss changing a medication dosage. Maggie heard Harry's voice through the thin wall, steady and resolute in a way that chilled her to the bone. "We've talked it over as a family," he said. "We think it's time to let her go. She wouldn't want to be kept alive like this. Wouldn't want." As if her 47 years of marriage had somehow transmitted her deepest wishes about circumstances she'd never imagined. As if Harry's recent conversations with Helen Morrison had given him special insight into Maggie's soul. "I understand," Dr. Carson replied softly. "It's never an easy decision. We can schedule the withdrawal of life support for Thursday morning. That gives you time to notify other family members, make any final arrangements. Thursday, 2 days, 48 hours to somehow break through the prison of her paralyzed body and prove that Margaret Williams was still fighting for her life." Maggie focused every particle of her consciousness on her right hand, the same hand Harry had held in the ambulance when he'd begged her not to leave him. She concentrated until her mental strain felt physical, willing her fingers to twitch, to curl, to give any sign of the desperate awareness trapped within. Nothing. Her hand remained as motionless as carved marble, betraying no hint of the screaming consciousness within. From the hallway, she heard the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes approaching. Nurse Patricia Young had been assigned to Maggie's care rotation, and unlike the other staff who moved through their duties with professional efficiency, Patricia lingered. She spoke to Maggie during procedures, her voice carrying a warmth that suggested she still saw a person rather than just a collection of failing systems. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," Patricia said as she entered the room. "I'm just going to check your vitals and make you a little more comfortable." The gentle touch of Patricia's hands as she adjusted Maggie's position sent waves of gratitude through her paralyzed form. Someone still treated her with dignity, still acknowledged her humanity even when medical science declared her absent. "You know," Patricia continued conversationally as she recorded readings from the monitors, "I had a patient once who seemed just like you, completely unresponsive for weeks. Then one day, she blinked. Just once, but it was intentional. Turned out she'd been aware the whole time." Maggie's heart rate spiked. Could Patricia see the monitor readings? Did she notice the way Maggie's vital signs changed during certain conversations? The family had already made plans, Patricia went on, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just like yours has. But something told me to keep watching, keep trying." She paused in her work, and Maggie could sense her studying the monitors more carefully. "Mrs. Williams, I know this might sound crazy, but if you can hear me, if you're in there somewhere, I want you to try something for me." Maggie's entire being focused on Patricia's words like a drowning person grasping for a lifeline. "I'm going to ask you to think about something that makes you happy. Really concentrate on it. Sometimes strong emotions can affect heart rate, even in unconscious patients. Happy." Maggie seized on the instruction, flooding her mind with memories of joy. Tommy's first steps in her kitchen, his chubby hands reaching for her as he wobbled across the linoleum. The morning Harry brought her coffee in bed for her 50th birthday, his hair still rumpled from sleep. The satisfaction of watching her. Roses bloom each spring, their petals unfurling like nature's own miracle. The heart monitor's beeping quickened slightly, just enough to make Patricia pause and study the display. "Interesting," she murmured. "Now think about something sad." The instruction was cruel in its simplicity. Maggie didn't have to search for sadness. It surrounded her like floodwater. Harry's plans to sell their home and move in with Helen. Her children dividing her possessions like vultures. The funeral scheduled for Saturday, the flowers already ordered, the obituary probably already written. Her heart rate slowed, the beeps becoming more labored. Patricia was silent for a long moment, and Maggie could practically hear her processing what she'd observed. When she spoke again, her voice carried a tremor of excitement barely contained by professional restraint. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to try something else. If you can hear me, if you understand what I'm saying, I want you to try to change your breathing. Not dramatically. Just try to make it a little faster or slower." Maggie had never paid conscious attention to her breathing before the paralysis, but now she focused on each automatic inhale and exhale with laser intensity. She imagined herself running, climbing stairs, anything that might naturally increase her respiratory rate. The ventilator continued its mechanical rhythm, but Patricia's trained eye caught something. A subtle change in the pattern, a slight variation in the depth of Maggie's breaths that shouldn't have been possible in a truly unconscious patient. "Oh my God," Patricia whispered, and Maggie could hear her moving quickly around the room, checking equipment, verifying readings. "Dr. Carson needs to see this. She needs to see this right now." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Patricia's voice carried urgently down the hallway as she summoned the doctor, her professional composure barely containing her excitement. Dr. Carson arrived with the measured skepticism of someone who'd seen too many false hopes dashed by wishful thinking. But Patricia was insistent, methodical in her explanation of what she'd observed. "The heart rate changes were too consistent to be coincidental," Patricia explained rapidly. "And the breathing variations, they occurred exactly when I asked for them. Dr. Carson, I think she might have locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome. The words hit Maggie like a revelation. She'd heard the term before but never fully understood it. Conscious awareness trapped in a paralyzed body. A nightmare condition. That could be easily mistaken for persistent vegetative state. Dr. Carson approached Maggie's bedside with renewed attention, her clinical manner softened by the possibility that she'd been wrong about her patient's condition. "Mrs. Williams," she said clearly, "I'm going to run some tests. If you can hear and understand me, I need you to work with me. Can you try to blink your eyes?" Maggie summoned every ounce of will, every fragment of determination she possessed, and focused it on her eyelids. The effort felt enormous, like trying to lift a mountain with her mind alone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, barely perceptible but undeniable, her left eyelid fluttered. The sharp intake of breath from both women told Maggie they'd seen it. "Again," Dr. Carson said urgently. "Try to blink again." This time the movement was slightly more pronounced, a definite flutter that couldn't be dismissed as involuntary muscle spasm. "Patricia, cancel that order for Thursday," Dr. Carson said, her voice tight with professional excitement and horror at what had almost happened. "We need to run a complete neurological assessment immediately, and we need to contact the family." As footsteps hurried from the room, Maggie lay in her mechanical twilight, feeling something she hadn't experienced in 2 weeks. Hope. Someone had seen her, acknowledged her presence, recognized that she was still fighting. But even as relief flooded through her consciousness, another emotion emerged. Dread. Her family was about to learn that she'd been aware all along, that she'd heard every word about Harry's affair, every discussion of inheritance and funeral arrangements, every revelation of their true feelings about her death. They were about to discover that the woman they thought was gone had been listening to everything, processing their betrayals, understanding exactly how little her life had meant to them once they believed she couldn't observe their behavior. The reckoning was coming, and Maggie wasn't sure whether her breakthrough was a blessing or a curse. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter as consciousness became communication. Patricia sat beside Maggie's bed in the pre-dawn quiet, her voice barely above a whisper as she worked through their improvised system. "1 blink for yes, 2 for no," Patricia explained patiently. "Can you do that for me, Mrs. Williams?" Maggie summoned her strength and managed a single, deliberate flutter of her left eyelid. "Good. Are you in pain?" 2 blinks. No pain, just the endless frustration of being trapped in her own body. "Have you been aware this whole time? Since the beginning?" 1 blink. Yes. The weight of that single response seemed to settle over Patricia like a shroud. "Oh, honey," Patricia breathed. "I'm so sorry. We should have known. I should have pushed harder when I noticed the changes in your vitals." Maggie wished she could reassure this angel of a nurse that none of this was her fault, but their communication system didn't allow for such complexities. She could only lie there, grateful beyond measure that someone finally saw her. Dr. Carson arrived as the sun painted the hospital windows pale gold. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of professional anxiety as she approached the bed. "Mrs. Williams, I need to ask you some questions to assess your cognitive function," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Do you understand where you are?" 1 blink. "Do you remember collapsing at your grandson's graduation party?" 1 blink, accompanied by the phantom weight of remembered apple pie balanced on her arms. "Do you understand that you've been unconscious? That we believed you were unconscious for over 2 weeks?" 1 blink, heavy with the accumulated weight of every overheard conversation, every painful revelation. Dr. Carson exchanged a meaningful look with Patricia. "Mrs. Williams, this is important. Have you been able to hear conversations around you during this time?" The pause stretched long enough that Maggie could hear the mechanical breathing of the ventilator, the distant murmur of morning shift change in the hallway. Finally, she blinked once. "Dear God," Dr. Carson whispered. Patricia leaned forward. "Doctor, we need to call the family. They were planning to withdraw support tomorrow." "Today, actually," Dr. Carson corrected grimly. "They moved it up. The funeral home needed more time for arrangements." She turned back to Maggie. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to contact your family immediately. But I need you to know, what you have is called locked-in syndrome. Your mind is completely intact, but the stroke damaged the parts of your brain that control movement and speech. With time and therapy, some patients recover limited function, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Maggie understood. This might be her reality forever. Consciousness without the ability to fully communicate. Awareness without agency. An hour later, she heard their voices in the hallway before they entered her room. Harry's tone carried a bewildered edge, while Bob's was sharp with something that might have been panic. "What do you mean she's been conscious?" Bob demanded. "The doctors said brain dead. You said there was no hope." "Not brain dead," Dr. Carson corrected as they filed into the room. "We believed she was in a persistent vegetative state, but locked-in syndrome can present very similarly. The key difference is that Mrs. Williams has been aware of everything around her." Maggie watched their faces as the implications sank in. Harry went pale, his hand moving unconsciously to his collar as if it had suddenly become too tight. Susan's face crumpled with what looked like genuine horror, while Bob's jaw worked silently as he processed what this meant for all the conversations they'd had in this very room. Dorothy, characteristically, was the first to speak. "Everything? She heard everything we said?" "It appears so," Dr. Carson confirmed. The silence that followed was deafening. Maggie could practically see the mental calculations happening. Who had said what? Which secrets had been revealed? Which true feelings had been exposed in the presence of someone they'd believed could never judge them for it? Tommy pushed past, his elders to reach her bedside, tears already streaming down his young face. "Grandma? Grandma, can you hear me?" One blink and Tommy's sob of relief filled the room. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry we gave up on you. I knew something was wrong. I felt like you were still there, but everyone said—" Harry stepped forward, his movements uncertain. "Maggie, we need to talk. There are things—" Maggie looked directly at him and blinked twice. No, she had no desire to hear his explanations or justifications. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The rejection was clear enough that Harry stepped back as if she'd slapped him. "Mrs. Williams," Dr. Carson intervened gently, "your family has been under tremendous stress. Perhaps we should focus on your recovery for now. There will be time for other conversations later." But Maggie knew there would be no easy path forward. The damage was done, the illusions shattered. She was alive, aware, and trapped not just in her paralyzed body, but in the wreckage of relationships built on assumptions that had proven devastatingly false. Her breakthrough had saved her life, but as she watched her family grapple with the consequences of their revealed truths, Maggie wondered if consciousness was truly the gift she'd fought so desperately to reclaim. The silence in the ICU waiting room stretched like a taut wire after Dr. Carson's words settled into their collective consciousness. Maggie could hear every shallow breath, every nervous shuffle of feet, every creak of the plastic chairs as her family processed what they'd just been told. "You're saying she's been awake this whole time?" Harry's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Through the thin walls, Maggie could picture his face, that particular shade of gray he turned when his blood pressure spiked. "Locked in? Syndrome means the patient is fully conscious and aware," Dr. Carson explained with careful patience. "She can hear, understand, and process everything around her. The damage is specifically to the motor pathways that control movement and speech, but her cognitive function appears to be completely intact." Bob's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. "How long? How long has she been?" "Listening?" "From the beginning, most likely. These cases often present as comatose initially because the signs of consciousness are so subtle. It's one of the most challenging diagnoses in neurology. Maggie heard Susan's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like a stifled sob. "Oh, God! Oh, my God, what have we done?" The weight of realization was settling over them like a heavy blanket. Every private conversation, every assumption about her condition, every plan they'd made thinking she couldn't hear, all of it had been witnessed by the woman they thought was beyond reach. "We need to see her," Tommy said, his voice steadier than the others. "We need to see her right now." "Of course," Dr. Carson replied. "But I want you to understand that this is going to be overwhelming for everyone." Mrs. Williams has been trapped in her own body for weeks, unable to respond despite being fully aware. She's going to need time to process your reactions, just as you need time to process hers. Harry was the first to enter her room, his footsteps hesitant on the polished floor. Maggie felt his presence before she heard him pull the visitor's chair closer to her bed. "Maggie?" His voice cracked on her name. "Honey, can you hear me?" With tremendous effort, Maggie managed the tiniest flutter of her eyelids. It was barely perceptible, but Harry gasped as if she'd shouted. Jesus Christ, she did it. She moved her eyes. He was crying now, really crying. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." The others filed in behind him, Bob standing rigid near the foot of the bed, Susan covering her mouth with trembling hands, Tommy positioning himself where Maggie could see him if she managed to open her eyes fully. Dorothy hung back near the doorway, her face unreadable. "Mom," Bob's voice was thick with shame. "If you can hear me, if you really can hear me." He stopped, unable to finish. Maggie tried again, this time managing to partially open her left eye. The effort was exhausting, but she needed them to know she was there. She was here. She had heard everything. Susan burst into tears. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry about what I said, about wanting to be free, about the inheritance, about everything. I didn't mean it the way it sounded." But even as Susan apologized, Maggie could hear the defensive edge in her voice. She was sorry she'd been caught, sorry for the awkwardness of the situation, but not necessarily sorry for the feelings themselves. Tommy moved closer to the bed. "Mom, I need you to know something. I never stopped believing you'd come back, even when everyone else—" He glanced meaningfully at his siblings. "I never gave up on you." Maggie's heart monitor showed a slight acceleration, her only way of responding to his words. Dr. Carson, who had remained in the room, noticed immediately. "Her heart rate increased when you spoke," she told Tommy. "That's a very good sign. It suggests she's not only hearing but emotionally processing what you're saying." Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Maggie, about Helen. About what you heard Frank and me talking about." He struggled for words. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I felt so alone, and you were always so busy with everyone else's problems." The heart monitor's beeping increased noticeably. Even trapped in her body, Maggie's anger was palpable. Bob stepped forward, his corporate training taking over. "We need to talk about what happens now. The funeral arrangements are canceled, obviously. We need to call the funeral home, return the deposits." "Jesus, Bob," Tommy snapped. "She's been conscious for 5 minutes and you're already talking. Logistics? Someone has to think practically about this situation." "This isn't a situation," Susan said, finding her voice. "This is our mother." Dorothy finally spoke from the doorway, her tone characteristically blunt. "Well, this is awkward as hell, isn't it? All those family secrets aired out for nothing." The room fell silent again. Dorothy's refusal to show remorse or vulnerability hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Carson stepped forward. "I think that's enough for today. Mrs. Williams needs time to rest, and frankly, so do all of you. This is a lot to process." As the family reluctantly filed out, Maggie could hear their whispered conversations in the hallway. Harry was already making excuses. Bob was calling his wife to update her. Susan was crying quietly to Tommy about how awful she felt. But Maggie noticed something else. The conversations had changed. Where once they'd spoken freely, assuming she couldn't hear, now their voices carried the careful weight of people who knew they were being observed. The easy intimacy of their earlier betrayals was gone, replaced by the awkward formality of people caught in the act. Nurse Patricia entered after the family left, her presence immediately calming. "That must have been incredibly difficult," she said softly, checking Maggie's monitors. "But you did it. You showed them you're here." Maggie managed another small eye movement, her way of saying thank you to the woman who had saved her life by refusing to give up. "The hard part starts now," Patricia continued, adjusting Maggie's pillows. "They know you heard everything. Now you all have to figure out what to do with that knowledge." As Patricia's gentle ministrations continued, Maggie reflected on what had just occurred. The masks were off now. There would be no more pretending, no more assumptions about her condition. But she also understood that knowing the truth and dealing with it were very different things. Her family would try to make amends, but could she forgive what couldn't be unsaid? Could relationships built on decades of hidden resentments and false pretenses be rebuilt on honesty? And perhaps most importantly, did she want them to be? The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm as Maggie contemplated her new reality, fully conscious, increasingly able to communicate, and burdened with the knowledge of who her family really was when they thought no one was watching. The morning after the revelation brought an awkward parade of visitors, each family member approaching Maggie's bedside with the careful uncertainty of people navigating a minefield. The easy familiarity of their previous visits had been replaced by something more complex, part guilt, part hope, and part fear of what she might communicate back to them. Harry arrived first, carrying a bouquet of yellow roses that he set on her bedside table with trembling hands. His face had aged years in the past 24 hours, deep lines etched around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been up all night thinking about what to say to you," he began, settling into the visitor's chair. 47 years of marriage, and I don't know how to talk to my own wife." Maggie managed to open her eyes partially, focusing on his face. The man she'd married looked exhausted, defeated in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. "Helen means nothing to me. You have to understand that. She was someone who listened when I felt invisible in my own home." His voice carried a defensive edge that immediately put Maggie on guard. "You were always so busy taking care of everyone else. The kids, the grandkids, your sister, the church ladies. When did you ever just sit and ask how I was doing?" The heart monitor's beeping increased, and Harry noticed immediately. He was trying to make his affair her fault, and even trapped in her body. Maggie's anger was unmistakable. "I know how that sounds," he said quickly. "I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying, hell, I don't know what I'm saying. I messed up, Maggie. I messed up bad, and I don't know how to fix it." He reached for her hand, then stopped himself. The gambling started small, just a few bucks on the horses with Frank. Then it was poker, games, then the casino trips. I kept thinking I'd win it back, make it right before you found out. The insurance money. He swallowed hard. "I needed it to cover what I owe. What we owe." Maggie tried to process this new information. The debt was apparently significant enough to threaten their home, their savings, everything they'd built together. And Harry had been willing to let her die to solve his problem. "I've moved out," he continued. "I'm staying at Frank's for now. Helen, that's over. It was over the minute I realized you could hear everything. But the gambling, the debt, I need help with that. Real help." When he left, Bob appeared in the doorway, hesitant and formal. He'd always been the most emotionally guarded of her children. but now his usual composure was cracked like poorly maintained concrete. "Mom, I need you to know that I've checked myself into a treatment program. Outpatient, but it's a start." He stood at the foot of her bed, maintaining distance as if proximity might make his confession more shameful. "I've been drinking more than I should for longer than I want to admit." Maggie had suspected but had never confronted him directly. Bob had always been so controlled, so successful, that she'd convinced herself his evening cocktails were just executive stress. "Relief. I lost my job 3 months ago. Corporate restructuring, they called it. But the truth is I wasn't performing. Couldn't concentrate, missed meetings because I was hungover." His voice grew quieter. "I've been living on severance and unemployment, but that runs out next month." He finally met her eyes, or tried to, given her limited ability to focus. "When I heard about your condition, all I could think about was how the inheritance would solve everything. How terrible is that? My mother is dying, and I'm calculating property values and life insurance payouts." A tear rolled down his cheek, the first time Maggie had seen Bob cry since he was a small boy. "I'm going to get sober, Mom. Really sober. Not just cutting back or making promises I can't keep. And I'm going to find another job, even if it means starting over at the bottom. I can't be the man who wished his mother would die to pay his bills." Susan's visit later that afternoon was more complicated. She entered with the cautious energy of someone who'd spent the night crafting the perfect apology, only to find that words felt inadequate in the face of what she'd revealed. "I enrolled in a nursing program," she announced without preamble. "Start this fall at the community college. Pre-nursing first, then the full program if I can handle the science courses." She pulled the chair closer to Maggie's bed. "I know what I said about being free, about finally being able to pursue my dreams. And the awful truth is, part of me still feels that way. I'm 42 years old, Mom. My kids are grown. My husband travels constantly for work, and I've spent 20 years being everyone's emotional support system." Susan's honesty was more painful than Bob's guilt or Harry's excuses because it was so raw, so unfiltered. "I love you. I love this family. But I also resent what I gave up, and I resent that no one ever asked if I minded giving it up. Everyone just assumed Susan would be fine, Susan would handle it. Susan would put everyone else first because that's what good daughters and mothers do." Maggie felt a complex mix of emotions, hurt at Susan's resentment, but also a strange pride in her daughter's finally speaking her truth. The inheritance thing. That was ugly. I'm ashamed I said it, but I'm not ashamed of wanting more from my life. I'm going to pursue nursing whether I inherit anything or not. Dave thinks I'm crazy to go back to school at my age, but I'm doing it anyway. Tommy's arrival that evening was different from the others. He didn't apologize or confess hidden sins. Instead, he simply pulled up the chair and started talking to her the way he always had. Directly, without filters or careful diplomacy. "The family's pretty messed up, isn't it?" he said conversationally. "I mean, we always knew it on some level, but hearing everyone's real thoughts laid out like that. It's like finding out your favorite restaurant has been serving expired food for years." Maggie managed a slight eye movement that might have been amusement. "Here's what I think happened," Tommy continued. "Everyone got so used to you being the family fixer that they forgot you were actually a person with your own needs and feelings. You became this function. The person who smoothed over problems and made everyone feel better about their choices." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm probably the only one who's going to say this, but you enabled a lot of this dysfunction, Mom. Bob's drinking, Susan's martyrdom, Dad's gambling. You made it easier for everyone to avoid dealing with their problems by always being there to clean up the mess." It was a harsh assessment, but Maggie recognized the truth in it. She had been the family's emotional janitor, and in doing so, she'd perhaps prevented them from learning to clean up their own messes. But you know what? None of that excuses what they said, what they planned. and it sure as hell doesn't excuse Dad's affair or his eagerness to cash in your life insurance. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then reached out and gently touched her hand. I'm going to take care of you, Mom. Whatever this recovery looks like, however long it takes, I'm going to be here. Not because I feel guilty or because I need inheritance, money. Because I love you, and because you deserve better than what this family has given you. Dorothy's appearance later that evening was briefer and characteristically unrepentant. She entered with her usual no-nonsense stride, surveying the flowers and get-well cards that had accumulated throughout the day. Well, this is a fine mess, isn't it? She said without preamble. Everyone's running around apologizing and making promises like that changes what they really think. She looked directly at Maggie, her expression unreadable. I'm not going to apologize for speaking the truth about Harry. You deserve to know what kind of man you married, even if it took 47 years. And I'm not sorry about telling everyone how I felt about you getting the perfect life, while I got to be the spinster aunt who babysat everyone else's problems. Dorothy's brutal honesty was oddly refreshing after the other's careful contrition. But I am sorry you had to find out this way. Nobody deserves to be trapped in their own body, listening to their family plan their funeral. She adjusted her purse strap and prepared to leave. For what it's worth, I think Tommy's the only one who came out of this looking decent. The rest of us, well, we're exactly who we always were. The only difference is now you know it too. As the day ended and visiting hours concluded, Maggie lay in the dim light of her room, processing the parade of confessions and justifications she'd heard. Each family member had revealed something true about themselves, but she wasn't certain that truth would lead to genuine change. Some people, when exposed, chose growth. Others simply became more careful about hiding their true selves. Time would tell which category her family fell into, and whether the relationships that survived this revelation would be worth rebuilding. 6 months later, Margaret Williams sat in her wheelchair on the sun-drenched porch of the small house Tommy had found for them. Watching autumn leaves drift across the yard, she was slowly learning to navigate. Her recovery had been remarkable by medical standards. She could speak in short sentences now, move her left hand with purpose, and operate the joystick on her electric wheelchair with increasing precision. More importantly, she could choose who deserved her limited energy and who didn't. The house was smaller than the family home she'd shared with Harry for 4 decades, but it felt more honest somehow. Tommy had converted the garage into his art studio, and on quiet afternoons she could hear him working. The scrape of brushes against canvas, the soft jazz he played while he painted. It was a peaceful sound, unlike the careful tiptoeing she'd grown accustomed to when family members thought she was too fragile for normal life. "Morning, Mom," Tommy called from the kitchen, emerging with 2 cups of coffee. His had become a ritual she treasured. No false cheer, no walking on eggshells, just the easy companionship of 2 people who'd learned to value honesty over harmony. "Good morning, honey." Her speech was still slow, deliberate, but clear enough that strangers no longer assumed she was mentally impaired. "Susan's coming today?" "Around 2, Tommy confirmed, settling into the porch chair beside her. "She wants to show you her first semester grades." Susan's transformation had been the most surprising. True to her word, she'd enrolled in the nursing program and was excelling in ways that seemed to astonish her own family. Her marriage to Dave had ended 6 months ago, an amicable divorce that freed them both to pursue the lives they'd been afraid to want. She visited every Sunday now, bringing textbooks and study guides, asking Maggie's advice about patient care scenarios. Their relationship had become more authentic than it had ever been when Susan felt obligated to be the perfect daughter. "She's happy?" Maggie said, and meant it. Watching her daughter discover her own competence and passion had been worth the pain of learning how much Susan had resented her sacrificed dreams. "She is." And Bob called yesterday, 3 months sober as of Tuesday. Bob's recovery had been harder to witness than Susan's renaissance. The confident executive facade had crumbled completely, revealing a frightened man who'd been medicating anxiety and depression for years. He was working as an assistant manager at a sporting goods store now, a job that paid a fraction of his former salary, but allowed him to sleep at night without wondering if he'd remember what happened the day before. He visited monthly, their conversations stilted but gradually becoming more real. "He's trying," Maggie said, which was the most generous assessment she could manage. Bob was doing the work, following his program, but their relationship might never fully recover from the knowledge that he'd calculated her death in terms of financial relief. "Harry's moving to Florida with Frank next month," Tommy mentioned casually, though Maggie detected the careful note in his voice that meant he was gauging her reaction. "I know. He told me." The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. Harry had kept his promise to end things with Helen, but the gambling debts had nearly cost them the house anyway. Maggie had chosen to buy out his half rather than sell their family home to strangers, though she'd sold it anyway once Tommy found this smaller place that better suited her physical limitations. Harry's visits had dwindled to brief, awkward encounters where he asked about her health and she asked about his recovery program. Gamblers Anonymous was helping him, he claimed, though Maggie suspected Frank's continued presence in his life wasn't conducive to lasting change. Some relationships, she'd learned, were too damaged by broken trust to rebuild, regardless of the apologies offered. "You don't miss him," Tommy observed. It wasn't a question. "I miss who I thought he was, but that person, I'm not sure he ever really existed." It had taken months of physical therapy and counseling to reach that conclusion. "I spent 47 years married to the idea of Harry rather than Harry himself." Dorothy's relationship with the family had remained predictably unchanged. She'd moved to a retirement community in Phoenix and sent Christmas cards with brief, impersonal updates. Her brutal honesty during Maggie's crisis had been painful, but clarifying. Some people were incapable of the emotional growth that trauma sometimes inspired in others. Dr. Carson's car pulled into the driveway, arriving for Maggie's monthly checkup. These visits had evolved beyond medical necessity into something more like friendship. Elizabeth Carson had become fascinated by Maggie's case, not just medically, but personally, often staying after the examination to discuss the complex dynamics of family relationships and the psychology of locked-in syndrome. "How are we doing today, Maggie?" Dr. Carson asked, settling her medical bag on the porch table. "Better. Stronger." And she was. The physical improvements continued slowly but steadily. More importantly, the emotional strength that had carried her through those terrible weeks of helpless observation had crystallized into something more valuable: the ability to distinguish between relationships worth investing in and those that drained her energy without offering genuine connection. In return, "Any new memories surfacing?" Dr. Carson asked as she checked Maggie's reflexes. The trauma of locked-in syndrome sometimes affected memory formation, but Maggie remembered everything from those weeks with crystalline clarity. "Nothing I want to forget," Maggie replied. "Even the painful parts. They taught me things I needed to know." After Dr. Carson left, Maggie and Tommy sat in comfortable silence, watching the autumn afternoon fade toward evening. Nurse Patricia would arrive soon for her weekly visit. No longer a professional obligation, but a friendship that had grown from their shared experience of fighting for Maggie's recognition and recovery. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never been able to communicate?" Tommy asked eventually. "If you'd stayed locked in forever?" Maggie considered the question. "I think I would have found a way to let go, eventually. But I'm glad I didn't have to." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Going through that experience, hearing everyone's real thoughts. It was devastating, but it was also liberating. "How so?" "I spent my whole life trying to hold this family together, trying to make everyone happy, trying to smooth over every conflict. I thought that was love." She moved her left hand to touch Tommy's arm. "But love isn't preventing people from facing consequences. It isn't enabling dysfunction to keep peace. Real love sometimes means letting people struggle with their own choices. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. You think they're better off now? The family, I mean? Susan is. You always were. Bob. Maybe. He's doing the work, which is more than he was doing before. Harry. She shrugged as much as her limited mobility allowed. Harry is who he's always been. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise. As Patricia's car appeared at the end of the street, Maggie reflected on the strange gifts that had emerged from her nightmare. The family she'd worked so hard to preserve had essentially dissolved, but what remained was more honest, more genuine. The people who visited her now chose to be there rather than feeling obligated. The conversations were real rather than performative. I learned something important, she told Tommy, as Patricia approached the porch with her familiar warm smile. Being the family peacekeeper isn't the same as being loved, and being needed isn't the same as being valued. Patricia settled into the third porch chair, accepting the cup of coffee Tommy brought her. Good day? She asked, noting the contentment in Maggie's expression. Most of them are now, Maggie replied. And it was true. The days were quieter, smaller, but infinitely more peaceful. She was no longer responsible for managing everyone else's emotions or solving everyone else's problems. The family that had gathered around her hospital bed 6 months ago, planning her funeral while she listened in helpless horror, had been replaced by a smaller circle of people who chose to love her without conditions or expectations. Sometimes losing everything false was necessary to discover what was genuinely true and valuable. Maggie had learned that lesson the hard way, trapped in her own body while her family revealed their real selves. But sitting on her porch now, surrounded by the people who had proven themselves worthy of her trust, she found herself grateful for the harsh education. The heart monitor that had once been her only voice was gone now, replaced by actual words, actual choices, actual relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. Margaret Williams had died in that hospital room in many ways. The woman who sacrificed herself to maintain family harmony was gone forever. But the woman who remained was stronger, wiser, and finally, truly free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Oh,